You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Well, hello and welcome to TFM's local books and comics show for Star Trek, and I'm just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and so excited that he is with me again, the one, the only, Casey Pettitt. How are you, Casey?
I'm doing pretty good. Spent the weekend at the Washington State Fair and did the Puyallup and fat and stupid now, so...
Man, that's fantastic. It makes me miss the Texas State Fair. I loved going to the State Fair every year. All the fried foods, like, the important ones, like, fried cookie dough and fried chocolate and stuff like
fried
that.
Butter.
So,
fried
exactly.
Beer.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. Wow, that sounds terrible. But
the beer was pretty terrible.
And what's funny is I remember I had fried butter, and it basically just tasted like a uber buttery croissant. Because, anyway. But before we dive in, just a huge thank you to everybody listening. We love it. We appreciate your support. And if you're not subscribed wherever you are listening to this, and that way you'll get all the episodes as soon as they drop. You can find us all over social media. We're at Trek FM on Twitter, as well as on Instagram. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. The entire network is there, of course. And you can also find a listeners-only discussion group called the Babel Conference and talk to listeners from all over the world. You can also check out our website at trek.fm, see what we've got going on, all of our podcasts. And then, of course, you can support us like Casey Pettitt or Greg Rosier over on Patreon, making sure that all of these shows keep coming to us each and every week. We definitely need your help, so do that. And again, that's Patreon at patreon.com/TrekFM. So, Casey, we have a couple of comics that basically go together because they're in the Day of Blood series. We had Star Trek 11 and Defiant number 7 come out, and really there's no difference in the sense that, like, they're both telling the same story. And goodness, I felt like it was so fun to be able to read them back to back, and there's so much that kind of happens in these two issues. And there's some things that, like, because we're leading towards the end of this series, we only have one more issue left. This wraps up, I believe, in Star Trek 12. This is just everything I've come to expect from this series so far. And it's not that I'm like, I'm not wanting to talk about it, but I just feel like people should read them, because if you're already liking the series, this just continues it in a really cool way.
Yeah, they're doing a great job with, we have Defiant, which is a spin-off of the Star Trek ongoing series, and then they've kind of brought them back together for this kind of one big cohesive story. So they kind of split them apart for the same reason that they're bringing them back together, which is pretty cool. And getting to see some of these characters interact in these stories, like Tom and B'Elanna, or even Scotty and Spock, and some of the other people in here. It's really cool to see them interact, when we're seeing characters from both sides. But yeah, I kind of mentioned before we started recording here, like, it's kind of weird that we got Star Trek and Star Trek Defiant on the titles, because this is really a very good just combination of both. There's, it's a good reason to get into both series. And yeah, this is kind of what we would want from a crossover, I think, in different comic series. So I think definitely worth picking up and we're headed to a pretty explosive conclusion, I think, next time.
Absolutely. No, I love the way that you said that, where this is exactly what you would expect from a crossover series, where you can't really tell the difference between the comics. I think the only difference here is really the artists working. And I love both of the art that's going on in Star Trek series as well as the Defiant series. I think they've been doing a great job. I think that this has been, so far, just a ridiculously exciting series. And as I've mentioned many times, I love the over-the-top nature of it. I think that because it knows exactly what it is, and it basically is the comic book version of the Star Trek universe, and they're not afraid to basically do all that entails. Like, I love that. And so I think in some ways this might be one of the smartest ways to do Star Trek comics, because it truly creates, almost like the Litverse did with the Litverse. This is like the comic verse, and I think that's great. And I really do hope that this will be able to continue for a long time to come, because I'm personally enjoying it very much. So we do have a new series that just started, Casey. It is a brand new Strange New World series called the Scorpius Run. And I'm really fascinated to see what you think of this first issue.
I like what you said in the previous things. Like, this is the comic book verse, the comic verse. This is it's starting off kind of a goofy story. They get trapped and they need to join this race in order to get out of this area of space. And it's a little over the top. It's kind of, I don't know, comic booky. And so, it's just the first issue. It's, just getting the story started. But as they have with some of the other Strange New Worlds comics that we've seen already, they're getting the likenesses down for the characters. The look of the ship and just the artwork in general is pretty good. But, yeah, it's just kind of like the stuff we got in this one was kind of a goofy little intro to this thing. And I am looking forward to seeing where it goes, because I think it could be fun.
Yeah, something about this I think is interesting, is that not long ago, or I guess maybe years ago at this point, honestly, they did a Star Wars series like this where Han Solo was a part of a race similar to this, it felt like. So in some ways, this did feel more like a Star Wars type of storyline than a Star Trek type of storyline. Even just, what they run into, which is this, I don't know, weird decapitated head alien that's a control of this, place in the middle of the Scorpius sector of space, and which I just the whole thing was a little bit off in that sense, but it also did feel like something pretty outlandish that Strange New Worlds would go for, and so yeah, I'm here for it. I enjoyed the artwork in it, and I'm interested to see where it goes. I will say that this is probably a series that didn't quite catch my attention or keep my interest throughout the whole thing. It just kind of, I don't know. In some ways it felt, because the way that they've been doing this, the Strange New Worlds comics, where you really want it to feel like an episode of Strange New Worlds, this one felt like it was like just like almost like a page too far for even Strange New Worlds into that comic bookiness. Whereas, obviously we just talked about Star Trek and Defiant have set themselves up as being as comic book as you can get. So I don't know. Maybe people think I'm a hypocrite in that, but it just, that's where I kind of fell down. It just didn't feel like it worked as well as maybe they wanted it to, for me personally.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. This Strange New Worlds, like the show, has definitely stretched the bounds of what we've seen in Star Trek before on TV, and it does kind of it's starting to feel like they're doing that to some extent with the comics. And, whereas the Day of Blood series and even just the ongoing Star Trek and Defiant series are more, I don't want to necessarily say serious in nature, but they kind of are. They're kind of darker stories and everything. And it seems like they're really kind of trying to do a total 180 here with the Strange New World series by doing something that's a little bit more fun and colorful and upbeat, I guess. And so, I don't know. I can see the connection to Star Wars, though I haven't, read any of those stories, but, even just some of the aliens in this one, like the guy with the tusks, even looks like they're pulled straight out of Star Wars.
I was like, wait, Gamorrean guards are, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But no, I totally understand. And I think you're right in some ways. There does seem to be a lot of intentionality here with this series so that it is differentiating itself for what they're doing in the other two series right now. And I don't have a problem with that at all. I think, in some ways you don't want every single comic that you're putting out to feel so similar. And of course, I think Strange New Worlds in general tends to feel more kind of light and airy anyway as a show. It's definitely not as heavy as something on the usual side as, something like Picard had been, or, I guess even Discovery in some ways like that, right? So yeah, but all in all, I mean, I think it's a decent first issue, and I think all of the issues here were good, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing the Day of Blood series wrapped up, and, kind of where they decide to go with the Defiant and the Star Trek series after that. What type of stories they have in mind, because it's felt almost like the entire run of those two series in the first place has been building up to this Day of Blood. Mm-hmm. And so where are we going to go from there? It will be really interesting. But yeah, I mean, Star Trek has been doing great comics recently. And I think, honestly, these three, you can't go wrong with picking up any of them. Well, Casey, we're going to be covering Cast No Shadow, James Swallow's book that follows up on many of the events of Star Trek, The Undiscovered Country. So I don't know, maybe we should go see if we can find our shadows. Casey, I remember when this book came out, and I knew I read it, and yet I really did not remember much of what happened in the story, which I'm always very excited when I'm rereading one of these Star Trek books. And one of the things for me that I think makes this book so worthwhile as a fan is the way that we're unpacking Valeris as a character, because obviously we don't get to really know her or what makes her tick in the Undiscovered Country because we just don't have the time for that. And that's where a book like this can really come into play. And, I love James Swallow's work. It has nothing to do with the fact that he put my name in a book once. I think he's been an incredible writer for Star Trek fiction. And here, I think he does a really great, he does the same type of job that I feel like Christopher L. Bennett does many times, where he's pulling a lot of different things together. And he really brought this character to life in a way that I completely forgot had happened with all the Star Trek books I've read over the years. And now couldn't be more thankful that I've gotten reacquainted with this book so that I can get to know this character again.
Yeah, this is, The Undiscovered Country is, in my opinion, probably my favorite of the original series movies. And so to have a follow-up book to that.
Same.
Yeah. It's just great having a follow-up book to that that's actually quite a few years later even. I think this takes place like 7 years after Valeris is...
it's 7 years since she was put in prison. So, it's been about 7 to 8 years since what happened, at Kittimer.
Yeah. And so we essentially have almost a different Valeris here just because she's spent this time, in prison and really getting to dive into her beliefs, I guess, to see what she was thinking at the time, thinking since, and I really liked the flashbacks and kind of continuing to go further and further back in time in those flashbacks to see, I guess, who Valeris was, because that's a story I'm really interested in, and I'm really glad that we got that too, because how does a Vulcan, get to that point? And we've seen Vulcans in like Section 31 and stuff, but just super interesting character to dive into, and so I'm glad we got to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that's really interesting, and like you mentioned, we go back in time with this character and successively continue to go further and further back until we are able to pinpoint the moment at which she is able to realize, okay, this is exactly where my hatred of Klingons came from, and how she used her Vulcan logic to be able to rationalize that as saying, oh, they're just dangerous. So, and the beauty of all this is something that, can be said of Vulcans in general and just logic in general, and what Spock was trying to teach her, which is, logic is only the beginning of wisdom, because you can logic your way into believing anything. And the danger of that when it is unchecked by anything else. And so I loved the fact that we went all the way back to her childhood to see the way in which a interaction with Klingons, with her family, who her father was an ambassador, led to this kind of corrupting of her logic. Corrupted logic, and that, what's interesting is that she has logical hate in her heart for Klingons. And she's never allowed herself to believe that until, she's been working with this therapist who's been trying to dig into her life. And part of that, obviously too, has to do with the way in which she's dealing with the ramifications, obviously, of her forced mind meld with Spock, and how she has to come to grips with the fact that the choices that Spock made were because of the choices that she had made. And she finds herself in a position where she must repeat the same actions that Spock made because of the choices of others. And to me, that was really, really fascinating, because I think it makes it so much more nuanced. Obviously, what James is doing here is really allowing us to have the meditations on torture. Mm-hmm. And the ways in which the choices of some people lead to the choices that other people have. And I found that to be really fascinating, because I felt like, and I wanted to ask you, that it seemed as though she realized that Spock didn't have a choice, that because of the choices that Valeris had made, Spock only had one choice, because that Valeris comes to that same position and realizes she doesn't have any choice because of the other choices that people have made. And so the interconnected nature of choice here was something that's really fascinating. And of course, all of this comes into, as we've been unpacking this character, and she's becoming willing to actually admit things about herself.
Yeah, she's definitely becoming more emotional, or more in touch, I guess, with her emotions as the story unfolds. But yeah, I really liked the parallel story that she had with the mind meld, because especially as everything we know about mind melds throughout Star Trek and even through the Litverse and everything, we know that mind melds are such a personal touch. And I mean, from what we see in Star Trek VI, Spock's mind meld with her was tantamount to rape. I mean, it was for a specific purpose, but she, I think, felt violated, basically, at the beginning of the story and when she's in prison. And by the time we get to the end of the story, she's now grown to a place where, like you said, the choices that she's made and the choices that others have made have led her to this place where she feels like she has no choice but to do the same thing to someone else who is resisting the mind meld as well, or trying to, because he has a weak mind, so he can't really resist. But just the amount that she's grown to have an understanding, at least for the position that she had put Spock in at that time, to almost, lament her choices to the extent anyways that it put Spock in that position to do something like that, because she doesn't like having to do it herself now.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because there's a refrain in the book that there's always a choice. Yeah. One always has a choice. The question becomes, do you have more than one choice? Right? And so what's interesting here is that I think, you see Valeris and Spock have both reached the same position when they're forced to do this, because the choice of inaction and not doing the thing is more harmful than doing the thing to the greater amount of people. And of course, as we know, specifically for Vulcans, the axiom, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. Right. And that's, it's the most utilitarian phrase on the planet. And yet that's what really drives them. Right. That's what they would consider the good. And so when that's your only choice, making that choice is what you have to do. And I think that's the interesting thing, is to watch Valeris learn that. I think, when we're unpacking her as a character and what leads her to be a part of the conspiracy to try to assassinate Gorkin and to succeed in doing so, I think I was also interested in the ways in which, as we unpack her, we can see places where, Spock himself was blinded to her. Mm-hmm. He did not really truly see her. And I think that's something that was really fascinating to me, and almost feels like there could be a whole other book in that sense, of, because Valeris feels like almost the Anakin Skywalker of the series, right? Where you have a renowned character bringing them up and sponsoring them and believing in them and not seeing in them the things that make them turn, or maybe turning a blind eye to the things that make them do so. And to me, that was also another interesting thing about unpacking this character, is you realize Spock missed a lot of things with Valeris as a character. And didn't necessarily truly see her, or even begin to think of the ways in which she had been impacted by her previous experience. And so, as he says, he was blinded by her accomplishments as a Vulcan. Mm-hmm. And, I found that to be incredibly fascinating. And I think, it's another place where, as James unfurled this character for us, it shone light on, and it brings to light all these things. So now as you watch The Undiscovered Country, you have all of these things running through your mind. Yeah.
And Spock, in the movie, Spock admits that he missed things about her. He was blinded by, her accomplishments. He was blinded by the prospect of peace with the Klingons. And, here we see her, in her past, or at some point in the book, she kind of realizes, or maybe she had realized long before, that she was just kind of the follow-on to Saavik. She was just another protege that he could take on, and it's kind of a good way that we could see too that Spock was flawed. He just sees another up and coming Vulcan, and even with all the things that we know about Spock and his childhood and his upbringing, I mean, he's not perfect either. And for him to just kind of assume, I guess, that, Valeris is this star student that's going to, succeed him on the Enterprise as the logical Vulcan bridge officer. I mean, from the things that we'd seen in her past, I mean, obviously she's a Vulcan, she's good at hiding her emotions and everything, but, and I would guess too, I guess she's even good about hiding some of those things from herself, because I'd be curious. I mean, she knew how she felt about the Klingons, but I'd be curious by the time the events of the Undiscovered Country happened, if she was really totally aware of where this was all going, and where it could take her life. It's kind of a Maquis Section 31, came up in the book, but kind of mentality of they're doing the unlawful good, I guess, and seems like Spock should have seen that, but he's looking for a protege, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's really interesting, just all of this talk with Spock and his relationship with Valeris, and he's on the cover, of course, but he has such a small role in the book. His role is very minor, and his real role here is to, help get Valeris out of prison with the, with Starfleet intelligence, so that she can go on this mission on the Excelsior, and with Elias Vaughn. And so, and it's so interesting because, again, as we're unpacking this character, I think, we're unpacking the ways in which both of them in the end come to the realization of the ways they talked past each other, the ways that they missed each other, the ways that they let each other down. And there does seem, by the end of this, specifically, for Valeris, it does feel like there's forgiveness towards Spock. And it's interesting because I don't really think that Spock gets that closure, at least through the book. And because he doesn't really get to know all the experiences that the Valeris ended up having, and they never meet again. Mm-hmm. At least that we see. And so I think that's a really interesting thing, because I don't know. I mean, I think it will be one of those things that Spock from this point on would always carry around in him, that would guide his future, which is to never take anything for granted, never take anyone for granted, and in making sure that, he does not ever assume now about anyone, regardless of who they are, because he's seen the damage that can be caused because of that. You can trust, but you have to verify, right? And to me, that was really interesting, and it almost makes me wish that there were like a follow-up short story with Spock's, side of this, and being able to, again, have some closure with that relationship with Valeris. And where we leave it at the very end of the book, there's that possibility, but Valeris doesn't take it because, she does not go to see Spock when it's she's starting another life with another name. Mm-hmm. And she goes to do something else instead of going to see Spock, who's on, I think, she's on a different planet at that point. Yeah, it's not Romulus yet, but it's so. Well, yeah, I just found that to be really interesting.
Yeah, and I do wish that there was more Spock in this book. I mean, yeah, he's on the cover because he's going to sell books more than Valeris would, because we know who she is, but the average Star Trek fan may not. But it's and even just in some of the flashbacks to see how they interacted when she was kind of coming up through the academy, we got a glimpse of that, of her at that time. And, with the paper that she wrote that Cartwright liked so much, where she was kind of admonishing what Starfleet does and how they behave and act and everything, and basically saying, like, we need to be more aggressive with the Klingons, basically. And he kind of, gives her the wink and a nod and says, yeah, write a different, like, I like this paper. I'm going to keep it. Write a different one for your class, though. And I just kind of wonder, where was Spock in that? Did they have discussions about this? I'd like to see kind of a one-on-one with her and Spock kind of talking about these things, and him kind of almost blowing it off like, she's just somebody young and trying to logic her way, through the galaxy. And then kind of lending some credence to some of the discussions they had in Star Trek VI, where he's like,
Yes.
I was blinded by, your accomplishments and everything. And
Yeah.
so we could see like that they've actually, like, the signs were there. And yeah, even a follow-on short story, just, e-novella, something like that would be good, I think, is a little bit. And again, yeah, I like your idea of even just like an epilogue, seeing him sometime in the future, just thinking back on Valeris, wondering where she's at, how she's doing, something just to get a little closure there too.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's one of those things where I, in some ways, I almost feel that a book that's leaving you wanting more in that way is a good thing. And it's not that it felt like it was necessarily a detriment to this book. It just felt like there was so much more that could have been explored, and part of that, it's, you could have made this, you could have almost had a whole other book or just a much longer book to really dive into that. But, on top of, unpacking Valeris and seeing the role that Spock had, we really unpacked the conspiracy of the Undiscovered Country, because there are a lot of elements that never really get explained, of course, in the movie. The Romulan element, and then, of course, we learned here that Krios, the planet we met in one of my favorite Star Trek episodes from Enterprise that a lot of people hate, with Padme Lansky and Trip, and where we meet the woman who will be the first monarch, the connections that Cartwright has with Valeris. I mean, I thought this is one of those places where we really have a lot of great connections made. And I think what we do is we flesh out what was on screen in a way that feels so perfect. Like, it just, everything I thought fit so well. And I really appreciated, just to start with, specifically learning that Nunculus was a Tal Shiar agent, and that they've been working behind the scenes to fuel all of these things, made so much sense then to understand that this Romulan, ambassador, and him being involved in this, of course he was a Tal Shiar agent.
Yeah, he's one too that I kind of wish we had a little bit more of. I mean, you don't want to have too much Tal Shiar or, this secretive stuff going on, but, when that was brought up, it actually, I don't even think they named him until about halfway through the book. We just got these little snippets of him, and then, once they named him and said, oh, he was there at Kittimer, I was like, oh, right. And it would make so much sense that the Tal Shiar would be involved. So I love, that's kind of tied in there. The Kriosians were an interesting race to bring in here for this, just because, we've seen them in that Enterprise episode. They were also in The Next Generation and The Perfect Mate with Jean Grey from X-Men.
Yes.
Yeah. But otherwise, we haven't really gotten, much of anything from them ever. So it was kind of an interesting race to bring in. I kept picturing the Trill in my head as they described the spots and the pigmentation, which I guess is fine because they look very similar. But it's I'm glad that we didn't just go back to one of the old standbys and have the Cardassians involved when they shouldn't have been or something like that. I'm glad we got kind of an unexplored race to some extent, one that we just really haven't seen or known very much. It just made for a lot of interesting characters that we could bring in, especially ones that are under the thumb of the Klingons.
I completely agree with you here. I think that this is one of the places where, really building into the Kryosians, having them be this, and very much a kind of a rogue element that you wouldn't necessarily expect, but then building into their story the way in which the Klingons, have annexed their planet and treated them horribly. It's a story that the Klingons have repeated many a times. I thought that made it really interesting. I thought it was great to have them in this element, because of their experiences with the Klingons. You can easily then connect them with somebody like Valeris and her experience with the Klingons. That, you begin to understand why these factions come together, even in the ways in which, because they are working towards, everybody kind of has their own desire of what the greater good is here. And so how you can get such an unlikely alliance that, like, why would they be allying with somebody like a General Chang? Well, you see why. And they even explain, why the Kryosians, somewhat agree to his terms, because he promises to, give them leniency once he is, running the Empire. And then on top of all that, like you mentioned, the idea of Cartwright. Well, we not only get the connection of him telling her to write another dissertation, but we also get the fact that it is the Ark Royal which saved her family from this, kind of Klingon tyrant who is trying to extract from this negotiation his desired outcome by force. And so I loved the way in which all of these things connected to help explain in fullness how this conspiracy came to be and how all of these different factions work together. And I thought James just did, this is just kind of one of those masterful jobs that we've come to expect from so many of these great Star Trek authors, where they accentuate everything you saw on screen. So now when you rewatch the film, you're thinking about all of those elements and they're enhancing everything that happened in the movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked that Cartwright was essentially the one that saved her as a child. And, to further your Valeris as Anakin analogy, I mean, Cartwright would almost be Palpatine here in that younger stage when, at the end of The Phantom Menace, when he's like, I'll be keeping my eye on you. And
yes,
I almost expected Cartwright to say that to Valeris here, because he's now witnessed, and that may not have been going through his mind at the time, but he clearly had some opinions about the Klingons even then. But, bring that forward in time, backward in our story, in our flashbacks with the dissertation. I mean,
right.
Whether she knew it or not, he knew of her from way back when, and probably did keep his eye on her. And for all we know, could have been kind of grooming her through her upbringing and her academy time a little bit more to her ways,
yes,
it's very possible that she could have, whether from therapy or, Vulcan meditation or something, come to expect what had happened when she was a child. But, instead she, in her own way, and I think with Cartwright's help, has built up this kind of festering hatred for the Klingons herself that I think is even so subconscious in some ways that even she doesn't realize how deep it goes for her.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up, because I think that really goes to one of the biggest thematic elements of the book, which is this kind of idea of continuously fueling hate. And the way that most hate is driven by fear. and so the whole Yoda phrase from bringing up the Phantom Menace, when you continually build into that fear, it stokes that hatred so that it just kind of continues on forever, and it, ruins everything in its path. And I thought that this was great because, there's that moment with Kaj, the Klingon operative, where she mentions to Valeris, like, oh, you just think all Klingons are the same. Where you see the other side as a monolith instead of getting to know them personally. We paint with these broad brushes, which is another thing that really helps fuel the hate that we have for one another and the fear that we have because of each other. And so I thought that was really, really interesting because you see that play out in all of these different ways with all of these different characters involved in this conspiracy. It's the inability to do basically the thing that Kirk is able to do, which is to transcend his hate, to let it go, to be able to finally see Klingons as something other than those that just murdered his son and are murderous killers, right? Nobody else that's a part of this conspiracy is able to do that until we see kind of Valeris being able to come to grips with that after all of this time of contemplation. And I just thought that that's such a sadly poignant thematic element because it seems as though this might be even more pronounced in the world where we're reading this book today than it was when it came out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that kind of theme throughout this book was, probably one of the best things about it, just seeing the hate in Valeris, but even just in Kaj, in what was his name, Rain, I think, and a lot of these other characters that were kind of battling against each other, and for their own purposes, for their own. Some of them are fighting for their freedom, some are fighting for others' freedom, some are fighting for the betterment of the galaxy, whatever it is. But seeing these characters interact and the change in Valeris through the book, I don't think she necessarily has less hate by the end of the book, but I think she's now able to, I don't think she necessarily has less hate at the end of the book as she does at the beginning, but she has a better understanding. And, I like that you brought up the discussion she had with Kaj and, painting everybody with a broad brush. I mean, we even do that in Star Trek. We have these monolithic cultures that, all Klingons are warriors or, whatever. And at least by the end of the book, Valeris's eyes are open, and even Kaj's eyes are kind of opened. And
yes,
especially once Valeris tells her, "My name isn't Convict." Like Kaj is still working through that, but she does have some respect or understanding, I guess, maybe of Valeris to the point where they can work together. She can save Valeris's life. She can put aside that hate when they realize they're working towards the same goals and that Valeris is actually trying to help them. Just a really good kind of narrative on how things could be if we kind of were able to stop and listen to each other and talk, the whole let's try diplomacy first, rather than, fighting first. I think is such a powerful message. And like you said, especially for the world that we live in today.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think Valeris has less hate, but I think it's still, like you were kind of mentioning with her and Kaj, it's a work in progress, right? Because, and the same thing, I think we saw that beautifully in Star Trek 6 with Kirk, right? It's a work in progress. To let those things go. It takes, I think, an intense amount of self-introspection and thought to be able to dismantle those mental like pieces that we've put in place, that allow us to, kind of hurdle over the problematic views that we might have. And so as you begin to dismantle that wall, and you take away those different bricks in the wall, you're creating new, almost pathways in your brain to make other connections, but that's work. It takes work to do that. And so I think that that's something that, we do see in the book. I forgot that Elias Vaughn was in this book. And what I love is that, of course, this is a character that we will come to know, especially throughout the Deep Space Nine relaunch and beyond, and will be a huge part of that. But to see his first mission for Starfleet intelligence from out behind the desk was phenomenal. And I think my absolute favorite part was when he referenced The Hunt for October. Basically, he's Jack Ryan, where he's like, next time, Jack, just write a GD memo.
Yeah. I think he even referred to himself as an analyst at one point.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a great character. One we know by Deep Space Nine, I think he's, over 100 years old. He's, kind of long lived. And so we've seen him in other books that take place between, the Undiscovered Country and, the Deep Space Nine timeframe, I guess. But he was a fun character to bring in, especially as a younger man, new in his field, but also headstrong, but he's earned it, I guess, or he's earning it. He's smart, he's observant, and just a good character to introduce at this time, I think. I did like too that at the beginning he is so sure of himself, takes his findings to his superiors. They say no, and to go back to his desk, basically. And he's got so much conviction that he takes his findings directly to Sulu and to Commander Miller, who he ends up working with. But I liked at the end of the book, it's just very quick, but it addresses that he was dressed down basically for that. Like he had something going into his record from the person that he did an end run around, and for insubordination, and rightly so. But it also just said that it's past. It's kind of a blip on the radar of his life, and he's on to other things now. I just like that they kind of tied that beginning and ending of the story for him together. But rather than just saying, "Oh yeah, he went back to work for that guy and everything was fine because he was right," he still broke the rules, but I think that's also kind of the Vaughn that we know in the future too. So it's just fun seeing him here, somebody that was introduced in the DS9 relaunch and then get to use him elsewhere. And I'm glad, to be honest, that it wasn't Dax. We get Dax everywhere. It's nice getting somebody else from time to time.
Yeah, I thought that was fantastic. He is a great character, and I think, James did such a great job by basically making his story the Jack Ryan story from The Hunt for October, where it's a man who is great at his job, has incredible instincts, and now has to learn how to think on his feet in the field, which is a whole different animal. But then he finds out that he can do, to push him to the limit and beyond. And I really liked that. I loved that part of this story. And like you mentioned, he's just a great character. And I also kind of wish almost that, we had maybe been able to get some sort of continuation of his story, through his growth in this time period and then beyond, because I do find him to be such an interesting character. And of course, he touches on all of these other characters that we know because he's lived through this kind of intermediate part of history. And then, of course, into everything we know for the 24th century. So I thought his inclusion here was fantastic. And, I just really enjoyed it. I have one last question for you. there are references in here, of course, to Section 31 and to Control. But the one thing about the book that I will say is that I never felt like those fully felt connected. And so, tell me, did I miss something?
I don't think so. It was brought up from time to time, and I think a lot of us have kind of connected some dots between Cartwright and Valeris and Section 31 just on our own. The way it was brought up in the book, it was mentioned at some point that it's kind of this, it almost made it sound like it's the worst kept secret of Starfleet is Section 31, but this secret society that's out there. And I didn't mind the mentions of it so much, just to kind of leave it hanging out there. Like, was this Section 31, or was this more this rogue element within Starfleet that's just kind of, well, not even just Starfleet, but a handful of people banding together for one goal.
Right.
So I didn't mind a little bit of mystery there. Some of the references to Control, though, were almost a little too much without connecting it to anything else, because it was like Control was giving instructions, Control was involved somehow, but then it's almost ripe for a follow-up if, we're going to have a true Section 31 and Control connection to this particular story.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. It just seemed as though it was one of those things where it felt a little too inside baseball for the Litverse, because we know what Control is, right? In the end, it's the thing that's behind Section 31, and we'll figure that out all the way when we get to David Mack's book, Control, that we've discussed with him here. So yeah, I found it to be one of those things where if you hadn't been up on the Litverse, you would have just kind of found that, I think, very strange, because there's no follow up to it in the book. And so therefore, yeah, it's one of those things almost like, yeah, I think that just saying it's basically, it's the one thing that I think James maybe should have like edited out, or maybe found a way to then make the connection for people who maybe this is their first Star Trek book to pick up, I do feel like that needs to be something that needed to be something that was just a little bit clear in the book. Other than that, though, I think we've had nothing but praise for this book. So I cannot wait to see what you are going to rate Cast No Shadow.
I am going to rate this 4.5 mind melds. I think that having Spock on the cover really kind of threw me for a loop when we didn't see or hear from him anymore, and got a little bit of Sulu in there, but I did find myself wanting some other original series characters in there, not to outshine Valeris or anything. I don't want it to become Spock's story or Kirk, or I guess he's dead by this point, or in the Nexus, but I don't know. I found myself wanting some more of that, but also even just some more, like we talked about, flashbacks with her and Spock and some of the connection there. So, but yeah, overall, very powerful story, a great follow up to, my favorite original series movie. So yeah, pretty good 4.5 on that one.
I went ahead and just, because I thought about 4.5, and I was like, well, Goodreads doesn't let you do that. So I just gave it a 5. It's 5 out of 5 shadows that I could see because I was not a trader. And I thought that this was just such a great book. I thought James did a phenomenal job, like you mentioned, with the Undiscovered Country. This is my favorite Star Trek film. And so the way in which he added to my enjoyment of that film, I think it absolutely leads me to giving this a great rating. But I think part of that is just, it's a great book, especially if you're a Star Trek fan. I think this is really a fantastic book. And it was so refreshing to read this after all of the books that we've been reading recently, where we've just been so disappointed. And this was phenomenal. So yeah, all in all, this was the type of book that, good tie-in fiction should be looking to itself to want to be.
And a good standalone story. I mean, it's a follow-on, but
yes.
A standalone, not part of a trilogy, not part of this huge crossover, but sits on its own. Well, I don't know about you, but I feel like I want to go watch Star Trek 6 again now and, see what I've missed in the past.
I do too. I was thinking about that as I was finishing the book this weekend. I was like, man, I just want to watch the Undiscovered Country now. And so, no, I love that though. And again, that's the kind of thing where when a Star Trek book can add to your enjoyment of an episode or a film, to me, that's fantastic. Mm-hmm. And so, love it. Absolutely love it. But Casey, if people wanted to catch up with you and, see what else you've got going on these days, where would they find you?
You could find me at Knitting Trekkie pretty much anywhere. I'm at Goodreads, Letterboxd, Instagram, and Twitter, or X, or whatever that's called now. And you can also find me on Facebook in the Babel Conference, poking around posts in there.
You could find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. You can also find me here on the network outside of Literary Treks in the 602 Club, talking about all of the franchises we love outside of Star Trek. You can also find me doing The Orb, Warp 5, Saddle Up, and The Artificial Tango. Over on the Nerd Party Network, you'll find me with a completed show called Owlpost with Drea Kaufman, talking about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series. And then I'm doing Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills, talking about Star Wars each and every week. And until next time, live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.